They don't want you to hear this. And maybe you shouldn't. But once I tell you what was found inside the demolished walls of a forgotten Wall Street building, you won't be able to go back to the man you were before, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about one woman's descent into madness. It's about the shadow empire of the Gilded Age, where fortunes were carved out of blood, secrets, and carefully orchestrated death. In the winter of 1885, beneath the glittering chandeliers of Fifth Avenue, stood the mansion of Eleanor Fairchild. To the city's elite, it was a palace of refinement. But to those who knew what was buried beneath its limestone facade, it was a mausoleum, a house haunted not by spirits, but by truth too dangerous to name. This is where her story begins: a widow, a sudden death, a secret she was never meant to uncover, and a descent so chilling, so absolute, that even the most powerful men in New York united to erase her from history. Before we go deeper, take one quick moment to subscribe and comment below where in the world you're watching this from. I want to know where the brave men who dare to hear these secrets are standing, because by the end of this journey, you won't be the same. Picture New York in 1885. Marble towers of finance stretching upward, immigrant sweat filling the streets below, and in the mansions of the so-called American aristocracy, candlelit dinners where the future of the nation was decided in whispers over wine. This was an age of titans, railroad kings, steel barons, banking dynasties, men so powerful that presidents bent to their will. But in their world, nothing was left to chance. Misfortune, disaster, even death itself were tools calculated and sharpened for profit. Theodore Fairchild, Eleanor's husband, was one of these men. Known as the Oracle of Exchange Place, he seemed untouchable, his wealth multiplying at a speed that baffled competitors. To the public, he was brilliant. To his rivals, he was feared. But to the men who sat at his table, he was something else entirely, a liability. And in one chilling November night, before the glittering eyes of New York's most powerful men, Theodore collapsed. Wine spilled across the white tablecloth, dark as blood. His wife's scream echoed through the halls, and in that moment, the woman who loved him most was marked. Not as a widow, but as a threat. They called it a heart attack. That's what the physician wrote, with his steady hand and rehearsed sympathy, as though the words could wipe away what Eleanor Fairchild had just seen with her own eyes. But grief can cloud a widow's judgment, and that is exactly what they were counting on. Her husband, Theodore, the Oracle of Exchange Place, did not die as other men die. He did not fade gently, nor did he go quietly into the silence of the grave. He clutched at his chest in terror, gasping, his eyes wide with recognition. Recognition. As though he knew exactly what was happening and who had brought it upon him. Do you see it now? This wasn't chance. It wasn't illness. It was a message, delivered at his own table, in front of his wife. And while Eleanor wept on the floor, his dinner companions, the city's most powerful bankers and industrialists, were already exchanging looks, already giving quiet instructions to the servants, already erasing the evidence. The mansion that night was not a home. It was a stage, and Theodore Fairchild was not a victim. He was a sacrifice. For days, Eleanor wandered the marble halls of her estate in shock. Letters of condolence poured in. The newspapers painted her husband as another tragic casualty of overwork, and the men who had been at that table made certain the story spread exactly as they needed it to. A brilliant mind lost to the burden of ambition, nothing more. But in the quiet of her husband's study, Eleanor noticed things others would have missed. The missing wine glass, the unusual haste of the servants clearing the plates, the way Heiress in Kensington, the silver-haired banker who controlled the city's railroads, had whispered something to the physician before pronouncing Theodore's death. She remembered it all, in fragments, replayed endlessly in her sleepless nights. And then came the silence. Her social circle, the same families who had filled her home with laughter and candlelight, now avoided her eyes. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Invitations vanished. She had not only lost her husband, she had been quietly exiled. Eleanor Fairchild had been mocked, but what they underestimated was her mind. Beneath her grief, a fire was awakening. She had been the perfect hostess, the perfect ornament to Theodore's empire. But now, with every whispered conversation and every missing document, she began to understand had been built not on genius, but on blood. And she would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The study was his sanctuary. Theodore Fairchild had guarded it as if the very foundations of his empire were hidden within those polished oak walls. After his death, Eleanor avoided the room at first, unable to breathe without hearing his voice, unable to cross the threshold without her chest tightening. But grief is a cruel alchemist. It turns sorrow into obsession, and by January of 1886, Eleanor found herself spending hours inside, searching for pieces of him among the silence. It was there she found the drawer, locked, heavy, a drawer she had never seen her husband open. The servants swore they knew nothing of its contents, but something inside called to her. When the locksmith's tools finally snapped it open, the air in the study seemed to change, as if some secret had been waiting for decades to exhale. What she discovered shattered the image of her husband forever. Bundles of newspaper clippings, train derailments, factory explosions, sudden deaths of rival businessmen, all annotated in Theodore's precise hand. Beside them, coded telegrams, cryptic letters signed only with initials. They spoke in half sentences, vague enough to protect, sharp enough to warn. Words like resolution, neutralized, Pittsburgh problem. The kind of language a man uses when discussing murder, but never daring to name it aloud. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read them. The connections were undeniable. Every great triumph her husband had enjoyed had been preceded by disaster for someone else. A competitor dead, a railroad crippled, a mining operation sabotaged. Theodore hadn't simply predicted the market. He had shaped it, with blood and ruin. And then, one letter chilled her more than the rest. Written weeks before his death, signed only HK, it spoke of urgency, of a decisive action required, and of a payment already arranged. She remembered that name, Heiress in Kensington, the silver-haired banker who had sat across the table on the night her husband collapsed. Eleanor pressed the page to her chest, her pulse racing. This wasn't random. This wasn't hysteria. It was conspiracy. But the deeper she read, the heavier the shadows grew, because she began to notice something else. Certain papers had been moved. Certain letters, ones she remembered leaving in neat piles, were shifted, sometimes missing. Someone else had been in the study watching, waiting. Eleanor realized with an icy certainty. Her husband had not been the only one silenced. She was next. The more Eleanor uncovered, the more she began to feel the walls of her own mansion closing in. What should have been her sanctuary was turning into a cage, its gilded staircases echoing with footsteps that weren't always hers. At night, she would swear the sound of doors opening and closing traveled through the halls, only for the servants to insist nothing was amiss. Then came the physician, Dr. Purcell Henley, the very man who had declared Theodore's death a simple heart attack. He began to visit more often than propriety allowed. At first, under the guise of concern for a grieving widow, but his questions were too pointed. Have you been sleeping, Mrs. Fairchild? Have you been dwelling too much on your late husband's affairs? He spoke with the practiced tone of authority, a man accustomed to labeling grief as hysteria, sorrow as madness. When Eleanor mentioned her research into Theodore's business dealings, his expression hardened. You mustn't trouble your mind with such matters, he warned, his eyes scanning the study with unsettling curiosity. Women of delicate constitution often lose themselves in dangerous thoughts. He suggested, no, insisted, that she consider rest treatments, the very cure that had driven countless women of her station into silence and submission. It wasn't only Henley. Eleanor began to notice faces she didn't recognize among the servants. New staff, hired without her consent, who seemed to linger too long outside the study door, their eyes following her with quiet calculation. Letters she left on the desk were shifted slightly when she returned. Papers disappeared, then reappeared as though mocking her memory. Even her correspondence with old friends began to falter. Some never answered, others written in tones colder than she remembered. And at the dinner party she still dared to attend, the atmosphere changed. Once men had sought her sharp observations, valued her wit. Now they avoided her, their eyes darting away when she asked questions. Conversations died in her presence. She was being cut out, erased from the circle she had once ruled. Grief, they whispered. Hysteria, they suggested. But Eleanor knew better. This wasn't madness. This was orchestration. A carefully constructed cage of silence and suspicion designed to smother her before she could speak. What she didn't yet realize was that this cage was older than her. It was part of a system, one that had crushed countless voices before hers, and she was about to collide with the machinery of psychological control that kept an entire age obedient. Truth often arrives not in thunder but in whispers. For Eleanor, it came through the trembling hands of Margaret O'Brien, her loyal Irish cook. It was April, the air outside still heavy with the last bite of winter, when Margaret approached her in the breakfast room. She twisted her apron in her hands, her eyes darting toward the hallway before she spoke. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Fairchild," she murmured, "but there's something I've been keeping." Eleanor, exhausted from nights of sleepless study, lifted her gaze sharply. Margaret's face was pale, her voice low. "That night, when the doctor left, I saw him talking with Mr. Kensington at the garden gate. They thought no one was near, but I heard him say clear as day, 'It's done. She won't see through it.'" The words struck Eleanor like a blade. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "You're certain?" she whispered. Margaret nodded quickly.
"I swear it, ma'am."
"I never meant to tell, but the way they've been watching you." Her eyes filled with tears. "You need to be careful." At last, the veil of doubt was torn. She was not imagining the silence in her halls. She was not inventing the way the city's elite recoiled from her presence. Her husband had been silenced, and now they were circling her, slowly, methodically, waiting for her mind to break or her courage to falter. But Eleanor was not ready to break. Not yet. That night she returned to the study, spreading her husband's coded letters across the desk. She began to connect the names, the initials, the disasters. One map of railroads linked to a resolution in Pittsburgh, another to a shipping accident near Boston. She traced each event like threads of a spider's web. And at the center always, the same men: Kensington, Cromwell, Wright, her husband among them, and the physician, Henley. The realization chilled her to the bone. The system was larger than business. Doctors, bankers, industrialists, all bound together, not merely by profit but by secrecy. They controlled not only money, but perception itself. They decided which truths lived, and which voices were branded as madness. And Eleanor now carried the one thing they could never allow to survive: proof. Eleanor Fairchild was no longer content to sit in silence. If the world wanted her to fade into grief, she would do the opposite. She would become sharper, louder, more relentless. The truth was in her hands, and the thought of her husband's terrified eyes that night drove her deeper into a dangerous resolve. She began reaching out discreetly to old acquaintances. A lawyer her husband had once trusted, a newspaperman she'd entertained at one of her dinners, even a priest, hoping that a confession might grant her protection. But what she found was not refuge. It was absence. Replies came late, or not at all. The lawyer was suddenly out of the city. The newspaperman apologized that his editors had forbidden him to touch such subjects. The priest grew uneasy the moment she spoke Kensington's name and urged her to abandon her search, for the sake of her soul. It became clear the web stretched farther than she had imagined. Influence, silence, pressure, and if all else failed, diagnosis. Dr. Henley returned, more insistent than ever. He spoke of nerves, of hysteria, of the tragic toll grief takes upon women. His eyes were too cold, too calculating. He did not see her as a patient. He saw her as an obstacle to be discredited. And Eleanor, sharp as she was, recognized the strategy. If they could not kill her quietly, they would bury her under the label of madness. And it worked, slowly, deliberately. The servants whispered when she passed. Neighbors avoided her gaze on the street. At gatherings, she caught the words carried on hushed breath. "Poor woman, she's not well. Can't accept it." Each word a needle, each glance a stitch, weaving her into a shroud of doubt. Yet even as the news of perception tightened, Eleanor did something they never expected. She documented everything. She copied Theodore's letters in her own hand. She wrote meticulous notes of her suspicions, of Margaret's confession, of the doctor's threats disguised as care. She hid these pages within the mansion, behind portraits, inside false bottoms of drawers, knowing that if she disappeared, her words might one day surface. But late at night, as the fire burned low and she sat hunched over her papers, a new terror took hold. She began to feel eyes upon her even in the emptiest rooms. Not the eyes of servants, nor the cold gaze of Dr. Henley, but something deeper. The sensation of being watched by the system itself, vast and faceless, pressing her toward collapse. The question was no longer whether they would come for her. It was when. Eleanor Fairchild had grown tired of whispers. If the truth was to be found, it would not come from priests or lawyers too frightened to speak. It would come from the men themselves, the ones who had sat at her table, who had clinked glasses with her husband moments before his collapse. And so, in a decision equal parts bravery and recklessness, she requested a private meeting with Heiress and Kensington. The silver-haired banker did not refuse. In fact, he agreed almost too quickly, inviting her to his townhouse on Madison Avenue. The butler received her with quiet courtesy, the kind reserved for those already dismissed in the mind of their host. And when Kensington appeared dressed in immaculate black, he smiled with the kind of smile a wolf gives before circling its prey. "My dear Mrs. Fairchild," he said, kissing her hand with feigned warmth, "I worried for you. Alone in that vast house. Have you been resting?" She ignored the condescension and fixed her eyes on his. "I know about the letters, about Pittsburgh, about my husband's resolutions." The smile barely faltered. Kensington poured himself a glass of brandy, the amber liquid catching the firelight like blood in crystal. "You are grieving," he said smoothly, "and grief breeds illusions. Theodore was a brilliant man, but prone to excess. I fear you've stumbled upon papers he never intended for your delicate eyes." "Do not speak to me as if I am a child," Eleanor snapped. "I know what he was part of, and I know you were with Dr. Henley that night." For the first time, the mask slipped. Kensington's eyes hardened. He leaned closer, his voice lowering to a hiss. "Careful, Mrs. Fairchild. There are forces at work in this city that even your husband could not control. Men who decide which lives prosper and which lives end. Do not mistake your curiosity for power. We allowed Theodore his throne. We removed it when he faltered. Do you imagine, even for a moment, that you could stand where he fell?" The words struck like ice water, but Eleanor held his gaze. For the first time, she understood the scale of what she was facing. This wasn't business rivalry, it was architecture, a system of control so vast that even death was just another tool. When she left his townhouse that night, the streets of New York no longer looked familiar. Every shadow was a watcher, every passerby an informant. She had seen the lion's teeth up close, and now the lion had seen hers. The morning after her confrontation with Kensington, Eleanor felt the first tremors of retaliation. It began with the invitations, where once she received 2 or 3 embossed cards daily, the stream dried to nothing. Dinners, galas, concerts, events she had always attended without question, passed without a whisper at her door. At first she thought little of it. Grief was an excuse society could accept. But then she overheard a conversation between 2 neighbors on the street. "Such a shame," one whispered. "The widow's not well. Poor thing imagines things." Imagines things. The phrase clung to her skin like damp cloth. Soon after, the newspapers struck. Not the front pages. They knew better than to give her that dignity. No, her name appeared in the columns that thrived on rumor. A certain widow of standing, lately prone to unusual obsessions. One paper suggested her late husband's affairs had disturbed her reason. Another hinted at a lady of high society, seen wandering her estate at odd hours speaking to herself. It was surgical, precise. By the time Eleanor entered a dressmaker's shop weeks later, even the seamstresses exchanged glances behind her back. Her reputation, carefully cultivated over decades, was being dismantled brick by brick. And then came Dr. Henley. Always Henley. He visited under the guise of concern, but his words carried the weight of a verdict already written. "You see, Mrs. Fairchild," he said gently, in the tone one uses with the fragile. "The mind can create stories when it cannot bear loss. You must trust us. We only wish to help the help." She nearly laughed at the word, but the cruelest blow came at church. Eleanor, desperate to appear composed, attended Sunday service, sitting in her usual pew. Midway through the sermon, she felt the weight of eyes pressing on her. Families shifting away, mothers whispering to daughters, and then the priest delivering a sermon on the dangers of vanity and delusions among the bereaved. Looked directly at her. That was when she understood. It was not enough to silence her. They wanted her erased, her voice reduced to a cautionary tale, her grief rewritten as madness. Yet beneath the humiliation, a fierce ember burned. If they wanted her mad, then madness would become her weapon. She would not vanish quietly into their narrative. She would write her own, and she would write it in ink they could never wash away. If they wished to paint her as mad, Eleanor decided, then she would leave behind a madness of her own making. One sharpened into testimony. She purchased a leather-bound journal under a false name at a small bookshop downtown, carrying it home hidden beneath her cloak. That very night, by candlelight, she began writing. Every detail she had uncovered, every whisper Margaret had heard, every name her husband had coded into his letters. She wrote with the fury of a woman whose voice was being stolen, determined that if her body failed, her words would not let history know. She scrawled on the first page that I was not mad. I was silenced. The act brought her a fleeting sense of control. For hours she would write until her hand cramped, the fire burning low, the shadows lengthening around her. Sometimes she thought she heard movement outside the study door, or the creak of a stair when no one should be there. At first she dismissed it as fatigue, but then one morning she found the journal had been moved, ever so slightly, from where she'd hidden it in the false bottom of her desk. Someone had been searching. From then on, Eleanor grew craftier. She made copies of select pages and slipped them into envelopes, hiding them behind portraits, beneath loose tiles in the cellar, and even sewn into the lining of her gowns. The house itself became her co-conspirator, a maze of secret caches. If she vanished, the truth would linger in the walls, but secrecy carried its cost. Her sleep fractured, haunted by the image of Kensington's eyes glinting in the firelight and of Dr. Henley's calm, predatory hands. At times she caught herself whispering aloud as she wrote, as though speaking to some invisible witness, and though she tried to dismiss it, she began to sense the outlines of something larger than men. A darkness that seemed to seep through the very city, pressing against her from all sides. Still she wrote, still she recorded. Each page was an act of rebellion, each hidden note a thorn in the side of the machine. But deep down she knew, the more she wrote, the closer they would come. And when they did, there would be no turning back. Eleanor knew her hidden pages were not enough. If the house burned, or if her body was declared too unstable to be credible, her words would rot unseen. The truth needed to escape. One rainy evening, she bundled a packet of copied pages in wax paper, sealed it with ribbon, and pressed it into the trembling hands of Margaret. "You will take this to the post," she whispered. "Addressed to Mr. Wallace of the Gazette. He is a coward, but cowardice can be bent. Say nothing of it to anyone, not even your mother. Do you understand?" Margaret nodded, pale as porcelain. For a moment, Eleanor felt a flicker of hope, but hope was short-lived. The very next day, before Margaret could even leave the estate, two men arrived at the mansion. They were not policemen, nor were they servants, too finely dressed for one, too coarse for the other. They asked no permission, offered no courtesy. They walked straight past the butler and into the drawing room where Eleanor stood. "Mrs. Fairchild," the taller one said, his voice low and polite in a way that reeked of threat. "We've come to collect something that does not belong to you." Eleanor forced her chin high. "I have nothing of yours." The shorter man smiled, almost pitying. "Letters? Papers, thoughts better left unwritten. You see, words are dangerous when they fall into the wrong hands." His eyes flicked toward Margaret, who froze in the doorway, clutching the concealed packet. Eleanor's heart hammered, but she did not falter. "My husband's words belong to me, and if you think you can strip me of them, you underestimate what a desperate widow is capable of." The men exchanged a look, something between amusement and disdain. Then, as if on cue, they tipped their hats and left without another word. But that evening, Margaret's mother fell gravely ill after drinking tea laced with something bitter. She survived, but only barely. And the message was clear: nothing Eleanor touched was safe anymore. That night, as Eleanor tore through the mansion checking her hidden caches, she realized the truth. The system had decided she was no longer just a grieving widow. She was a threat, and threats, in their world, did not live long. The Fairchild mansion had always been a symbol of power, its marble floors and sweeping staircases designed to impress, to remind visitors of the family's unshakable place in New York's hierarchy. But after the visit from the two men, Eleanor began to see it differently. The locks on the doors, once reassuring, now seemed like shackles. The tall windows, with their velvet drapes, offered no view except the watchful shadows of men loitering on the street below. Even the servants, many of whom had been in the family's employ for years, felt altered. Some avoided her eyes entirely, others lingered too long, as if studying her. And at night, the sounds grew unbearable. The slow turn of a key in a lock she had not ordered bolted. The groan of a floorboard outside her bedroom at hours when no one should be awake. Once, when she rose suddenly and opened her door, she caught sight of a figure slipping into the darkness, tall, broad-shouldered, his face swallowed by shadow. Margaret clung to her mistress like a child. "They're inside, aren't they?" she whispered one night. "Not just outside, inside." Eleanor could not deny it. She began to test the doors herself, discovering that some now opened only with keys she did not possess. Her movements were quietly, invisibly restricted. The east wing of the house was suddenly under repair. The cellar doors were padlocked. Even the carriage house, once hers to command, was guarded by a new driver she had not hired. The realization struck her with icy clarity. She was no longer mistress of her own estate. She was a prisoner within it. Still, Eleanor's defiance did not break. She prowled the halls at night, clutching a candle and a small knife she kept hidden in her sleeve. She whispered her husband's name to the shadows, daring them to strike. And every evening, she added more pages to her journal, writing faster, more feverishly, as if racing against the noose tightening around her. Yet in the deepest hours of the night, when the house creaked and the lamps guttered, she sometimes wondered if they were simply waiting for her to tire, to falter, to collapse into the role they had written for her. And in those moments, Eleanor Fairchild felt the first true tremors of fear, not of them, but of the walls themselves. The decision came in the silence before dawn. Eleanor stood at her bedroom window, watching the lamplighters extinguish their flames, and knew she could not survive another week entombed in her own home. The mansion was no longer walls and furniture. It was a snare, closing tighter each day. If she stayed, she would be erased. By candlelight, she bundled her journal into a satchel, wrapped a cloak around her shoulders, and slipped from her room. Margaret, pale and trembling, followed close behind. "Where will we go?" the girl whispered. "Anywhere but here," Eleanor breathed. "So long as the truth leaves with us." The corridors seemed endless, every corner echoing with imagined footsteps. They reached the servants' stairwell, descending into the shadowed kitchen. For once, no one stirred. The great iron door to the courtyard stood just ahead. Eleanor's heart surged. Freedom was within reach, but when she pressed her hand to the latch, the door refused to yield, locked from the outside. She tried the scullery exit, also barred. The pantry window, nailed shut. Every passage she tested was sealed, as though the house itself had been rewired against her. Margaret began to sob, covering her mouth to stifle the sound. "Whoosh!" Eleanor hissed, though her own pulse thundered in her ears. A low creak above made her freeze. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, descending the main staircase. Whoever it was, they knew. They were letting her try, letting her fail. Panic clawed at her throat. She pulled Margaret into the wine cellar, shutting the heavy door behind them. In the darkness, she pressed her hand against the girl's trembling arm. "They want us to believe there is no escape," she whispered. "But even cages have cracks." Still, as the footsteps faded and silence reclaimed the halls, Eleanor understood the truth. The mansion was no longer hers. It had been refitted into her asylum, every exit accounted for, every path to freedom observed. And worse still, someone wanted her to know it, to feel the futility, to break before she ever reached the threshold. But Eleanor Fairchild was not broken. Not yet. If the house had become her prison, then she would turn the prison into her stage. And when the curtain rose, the world would finally see the performance they had tried so hard to bury. If they had built her a prison, Eleanor would make it a stage. If they wished to brand her mad, she would wield madness as a weapon. For days she withdrew into silence, pretending to comply, letting the household believe her spirit had thinned. She walked the halls with downcast eyes, answered questions with soft nods, and allowed the physicians to mutter their assessments while she sat like a doll in her chair. Margaret, terrified, thought her mistress was surrendering. But at night, behind the locked door of her study, Eleanor planned. She would not slip away like some ghost in the night. She would not be erased by whispers and forged records. No, if the system wanted to silence her, it would have to strike her in full daylight, before witnesses, before society itself. And she would leave them with words they could not scrub away. On Sunday morning, when the family pew at St. Paul's Cathedral filled as it had for generations, Eleanor Fairchild arrived in black silk, veil drawn, satchel clutched tight to her chest. The whispers began immediately. She had not been seen in public for weeks, and her sudden reappearance was a spectacle. When the rector began his sermon, Eleanor rose. "Forgive me, Father," she said, her voice carrying through the vaulted chamber, "but I must speak before God and man alike." The congregation stirred, scandalized. Women gasped. Men frowned. Eleanor pulled the journal from her satchel and held it high. "My husband's death was no fever. His passing was orchestrated, buried in silence, wrapped in deceit. And those who call me unwell do so only because the truth threatens them. I have written every word, every name, every deed. It will not vanish, not while I breathe." Chaos erupted. Some rose to hush her, others to protect her. The rector's voice boomed for order, but Eleanor would not stop. "If they destroy me, let this moment stand as witness. I was not mad. I was made into madness. And so help me, I will tear the veil from this city's corruption, even if it costs me everything. The satchel spilled as she flung it open, pages scattering down the aisle like blackened leaves. Gasps filled the cathedral as hands snatched them up, eyes scanning the damning words. Eleanor had done it. She had forced the system into the open, and now she knew they would come for her with everything they had. The storm broke before Eleanor even left the cathedral. Uniformed officers appeared at the doors, though no summons had been read. Men she recognized, those same messengers who had haunted the mansion, moved like wolves among the pews, gathering her pages, tearing them from trembling hands. A hush fell over the congregation as Eleanor was seized by the arms, her veil torn away. "Madwoman," someone muttered, hysterical, but others looked unsettled. Pages had already been read. Words had already been carried beyond the church walls, and words once loosed could not be wholly recalled. Eleanor did not resist. Her body was dragged down the aisle, but her chin never dropped. She caught Margaret's wide, tear-streaked face in the crowd and managed a single nod. Keep the fire burning. The next hours blurred into confinement, a carriage ride with shuttered windows, iron gates clanging shut, the acrid stench of laudanum in the air. She was deposited in a private asylum on the edge of the city, one funded, she learned, by the very men her writings condemned. "Rest, Mrs. Fairchild," the physician crooned. "All this struggle has wearied your mind. We will help you forget." But Eleanor refused to forget. She scratched words into her bed frame with the sharp edge of a spoon, whispered her husband's name to any who would listen, and recited her journal aloud in fragments until orderlies silenced her. They strapped her wrists. They starved her of ink and paper. Still, her story seeped into cracks, carried by a sympathetic nurse, by Margaret's hidden visits, by the faint etchings carved into wood and stone. The retaliation was thorough, but never perfect. Months later, Eleanor Fairchild's death was reported as natural causes of the mind. The papers printed it as fact, and most of society turned the page. Another fallen widow, another cautionary tale of female fragility. Yet something lingered. A handful of her pages, rescued from the cathedral floor, smuggled by Margaret, circulated quietly in parlors and studies. The words were messy, incomplete, but electric. Whispers began about corrupt physicians, about asylums filled with inconvenient wives, about deaths too neatly explained. Her enemies had buried the woman, but not the fire. Years later, reformers would invoke her name. The Fairchild case, they called it. Not all the details survived, twisted as they were by rumor and revision, but the heart remained a widow who had stood before her world and dared to name the truth. Eleanor herself was gone, but her defiance lived on in every question raised, every institution doubted, every locked door forced open by those who came after. And in that sense, Eleanor Fairchild had won, not by escaping her cage, but by breaking the silence that made it possible.